All right. So yeah, so pretty much the format of the debate is that there's going to be an opening. It'll be 10 minutes each, and if you run over, you'll have like a 30-second grace time to like finish your sentence or finish your thought. And then there will be a response time, which will be 10 minutes each as well. And then after that will be Crossfire or a Q&A. So Crossfire would just be like if you guys want to kind of go back and forth and debate a little bit, and Q&A would just be opening up to the audience and see what everyone has to say. So yeah, I guess we can go ahead and start with Perichoresis. Yeah, you can go and give your opening statement, give your argument for why the transcendental argument for God is an effective proof for the Christian worldview.
Right. So as he said, the question tonight is the transcendental argument for God, which I'll call tag, an effective proof for the Christian worldview. And it's a tricky question because tag is a metalogical argument. That means there are a whole host of things typically taken for granted that are being called into question. This would include things like the viability of logic, the belief that the future will resemble the past, words as a viable medium for communicating meaning, the existence of truth, human access to truth, the nature of universals, the reliability of sense perception, the nature of man, the priority of unity and distinction, and there's actually more. The conversation that tag raises is asking questions about the framework in which one interprets a phrase like an effective proof. There is a sense in which it is an effective proof, as it illustrates that the question tonight is only intelligible if the Christian worldview is the case. There's a lot of background knowledge one needs to understand in order for the argument to make sense and to understand why it's actually stronger than classical arguments. I'm going to do my best in the time allotted to give you that background knowledge so that what occurs throughout the rest of the debate might make more sense. There are three major branches of philosophy, that is metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Respectively, these areas of philosophy deal with existence, knowledge and justification, and values and value judgments. Once one understands this, it's pretty easy to recognize that assertions about the world involve all three domains of study. You cannot talk about what you know without assuming that knowledge exists, or that there exists a subject that, or without assuming that there exists a subject that has ownership over that knowledge. You cannot talk about what exists without assuming that you are warranted in believing things about the nature of the world. You cannot talk about values and value judgments without the existence of values and some standard by which to make sense of those value judgments. You cannot talk about what you know without some means of justification. Inherent in the method one uses to justify claims will be a value judgment concerning the nature of truth and falsehood. What I'm trying to get people to grasp is that we as human beings do not make assertions from a position of neutrality. Rather, the propositions that we make can be seen as fitting into a web of beliefs where each node is connected and related to all the other nodes in the web. Our more fundamental beliefs, like the ones I mentioned earlier, are closer to the middle of the web. The reason for placing them here in the illustration is to show that they are more important to the overall structure of the philosophical paradigm in question. At the most common scope of discourse, as I said earlier, these things are typically unjustified. However, many systems of logic and language are complex enough that they are capable of self-reference. It is when we begin to question what it is that connects and interrelates all these preconditions that we enter into the metadisciplines. This is where transcendental arguments come into the discussion. A transcendental is nothing more than a precondition for our experience, like the ones I mentioned earlier. They are necessary in order for us to even begin the act of debating or having conversation or anything like that. One form that transcendental arguments can take is modus ponens. So modus ponens is if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, where P is a sufficient condition for the necessity of Q. What makes a transcendental argument unique is not its form, but it is that the consequent is rejected by someone's opponent, while the antecedent will fit one or more of these criteria. The antecedent will be immune to doubt. The antecedent is something that one's opponent already accepts to be the case, or the antecedent will be needed for one's opponent to be able to state his disagreements or even skepticism. I'm going to give the transcendental argument in a deductive illustration. It's important to remember that the viability of deduction is in question, so the conversation we are having takes place prior to one's acceptance of deduction. So I'm giving it form to clarify or illustrate what's being said. And essentially what I'm saying is if there is a set of interrelated preconditions that make sense of our experience, then the Christian worldview is true. There is a set of these interrelated preconditions that make sense of our experience, and therefore the Christian worldview is true. Because either it is the Christian worldview that is the only coherent grounds for this set of interrelated preconditions, or it is not the Christian worldview that coherently grounds the set of interrelated preconditions. It is not the case that it is not the Christian worldview that coherently grounds the set of interrelated preconditions, and therefore we're going to say that the Christian worldview is the only coherent grounds for the set of interrelated preconditions. And the reason this argument is effective is not because the skeptic is immediately going to recognize that God is required for all these things. It's effective because it forces the skeptic who tries to deny this argument to take a good look at their own ultimate context for how they make sense of the world and to compare it to Christianity. Chum doesn't believe in God, and there's only a limited number of options in the realm of metaphysics that he has available to him. One option will be to ground these preconditions in the world of physical stuff that is either in flux or in stasis. Let's take a look at that option. Does unity or distinction take priority in a world like this? If we take a monistic approach, then the distinctions that humans draw amongst reality are not reflections of the ontology of the world. Thus, a simple assertion like there's a piece of gold on the table is false, as there is no distinction between the gold or the table or even their positions in space-time. If we take a pluralistic approach, then the unity of objects in our experience are not reflections of our reality either, and therefore the assertion that there is a piece of gold on the table is again false, as there is no single object there but a host of unrelated particulars. If we ground these preconditions in the material world, then the identity of objects must change over time. That is, if matter is in flux, and if matter is in stasis, then change becomes an illusion. And beyond this, when we approach this meta level of discussion and begin to question things which are normally taken for granted, we will be faced with an epistemological trilemma known as the Munchausen's trilemma. In our search for knowledge, we will find that our epistemological systems are one of three ways. The first horn of the trilemma takes a circular approach in which the proof of some proposition is supported only by presupposing that proposition. This is the route I have taken in the debate, as I find it to be the most rational. If something is the ultimate grounds or authority of a particular paradigm, then by its very nature it must be self-verifying. If it is contingent upon some other grounds or has some other authority over it, that thing would take a type of metaphysical priority over that, and thus is more ultimate. The second horn of the trilemma takes what we might call the regressive argument, in which each proof requires a further proof. The problem with this is that no assertion can ever be proven. The chain of justification that provides for epistemic warrant would be unable to be traversed. And this one would have no epistemic warrant for those claims like there is a piece of gold on the table, because they would always need some other state of affairs to be the case in order that they may know there is a piece of gold on the table. The last horn of the trilemma takes an axiomatic approach, which is to say that we ought to rest our knowledge on accepted precepts which are merely asserted rather than defended. I believe this is the route that Chum takes, and he may correct me if I'm wrong. But the issue with this is that it rests one's knowledge in pure arbitrariness. The chain of justification that is meant to provide one for epistemic warrant for their belief that there is a piece of gold on the table is ultimately arbitrary. I heard a priest say this once, and I quite enjoyed it, and so I'll say it for you guys here. To those who say that I have no reason to believe in God's existence, I will say to you that you have no God to reason. The God of reason is not reasoned towards, but rather he is reasoned from. Thus, we all make sense of tonight's debate question, either in the light of pure arbitrariness or in the light of some ultimate context. If Chum denies that context is God and doesn't want any further assertions that he makes to merely be arbitrary statements, he's going to have to provide a grounds from which he can enter into this kind of metalogical discussion. And that will end my time there.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Perichoresis. But yeah, go ahead, Big Chum time, and feel free to give your opening statement.
All right. Thank you all for coming. The topic of the debate tonight is the transcendental argument for God, tag, an effective proof for the Christian worldview. So first, let's get some definitions out of the way. What's a worldview? There are different ways of understanding what a worldview is and how it is formed, but one natural way of understanding worldviews is that a worldview is just a list of propositions that an agent believes to be true. What is the Christian worldview? As much as Christians gloss this over, we've already reached our first problem, because the problems of interpretability, the only source Christians have to appeal to as the basis for all of Christian theology, the Bible, there exists no definitive original copies of the Bible, many differing interpretations, both in translation of the languages, proper interpretation of the story's significance, doctrine, and this needs to be sifted through to determine answers to questions that may no longer be possible to answer. I hope that my opponent tonight gives a thorough answer to this question, since the debate is whether or not the tag argument gives a proof for the Christian worldview. Which Christian worldview is the question? It seems readily apparent there is no singular the Christian worldview, and Christian apologists seem largely divided on whether presuppositionalism can even be the basis for a cogent argument for Christianity. Now, what's a transcendental argument? A transcendental argument forms the backbone of presuppositional approach to Christian apologetics, first formulated by Cornelius Van Til. At its simplest, it is a radical defense of the Christian position, which boldly tries to dismiss any counterargument with the claim that even the notion of argument itself presupposes the Christian position. Now, if this is true, then the opponent of Christianity would have to assume the truth of the proposition they oppose when presenting any argument at all. But this is where the monumental task begins for such a monumental claim. It will be no simple task, and in fact, if my opponent tonight attempts to do so by asking questions with intent to poke holes in my worldview, it will ultimately amount to a wasting of his or her time. Because, for the sake of argument, I could readily grant that all defenses of my worldview are impotent towards his prying questions about my justifications, basic beliefs, and so on, and yet his burden of proof in the debate would be no closer to having been met, since the tag argument states that it is an argument to the conclusion which, 1, the Christian worldview is a sufficient condition to be able to affirm or deny any proposition, and that, 2, no other worldview can. So regardless here, if I'm able to give a coherent account for the justifications of my worldview, or even whether I make an attempt to, he will have no come closer to meeting his burden of proof, which is, again, him showing that I must necessarily presuppose the Christian God a priori in order to affirm or deny any proposition. What is a proof? A proof is constituted by sufficient evidence or argument for the truth of a proposition. What is a presupposition? A presupposition is an implicit assumption about the world or a belief relating to an utterance whose truth is taken for granted in discourse. Specifically, as it relates to a worldview, a presupposition is the bottommost beliefs within your worldview which serve as a foundation for a coherent model-building basis of yourself and the world around you. Now, what is the difference between a grounding argument and a transcendental argument? Presuppositional apologists sometimes confuse what they call the transcendental argument with grounding arguments. Presuppositional apologists often give the example of logic being transcendentally necessary because one must employ logic to deny logic. Since it would be self-defeating to use logic to show that logic cannot be defeated, the denial of logic can be transcendentally approved. The argument to ground is similar in that it uses the necessity of one thing in its argument. Unlike transcendental arguments, however, grounding arguments proceed from the existence of some effect to a necessary condition for that effect. The form would be something like this. X is necessary for Y, so if one denies X, one must also deny Y. The key to these differences is that while logic is required to deny logic, morality, for example, is not necessary to deny morality. Logic, then, is shown to be transcendentally necessary, while God, in the moral argument, is not. It is actually a grounding argument here. For morality to exist, God must exist, morality exists, therefore God exists. The problem is that presuppositionalists will often give an example of a valid transcendental argument, but then switch to grounding arguments in their actual, even when defending their own system. This confusion also leads some apologists into thinking that presuppositionalism is much stronger and more distinct as an apologetic than it really is. Will the Christian interlocutor tonight be able to show reasonable proof that God is more fundamental than logic, reason, proof, truth? It seems highly doubtful and even impossible, since again, he would need to show how God is required for such things without taking such things for granted, even demonstration and argument, while using tactics and argumentation unavailable to other worldviews. Now, according to Michael Butler, professor of philosophy at Christ Church College, Virginia, who studied under Bonson, he says, tag starts with human experience, things such as science, love, rationality, and moral duties. Then asserts the Christian God is the only possible necessary precondition for such experiences. Finally, it proves this indirectly by demonstrating the impossibility of the contrary. How does tag claim to be able to do this? By adopting the terms and conditions of the alternative view, by adopting terms and conditions of the alternative explanations and showing them on their own basis. Operating on the basis of its own assumptions. And that's a quote from Van Til, Survey of Christian Epistemology. This method is called an internal critique, where one assumes the interlocutor's position to show that it leads to internal inconsistencies. Either A, there is one way to establish that all the non-Christian worldviews are internally incoherent, or B, one proof is not enough, but there is a finite number of ways to establish that they are all incoherent, or C, there is an infinite number of ways required to establish that they are all incoherent. No proponent of tag has established A, and it seems easy to prove that B cannot be established given a plausible formulation of worldview as a set of beliefs, and if C, then it is not possible for a finite being to prove tag. The tag proponent is left to refute not just one worldview, but an infinite number of them. Why? Because we can mix and match between different combinations of philosophical positions to form separate worldviews. An atheist can be a materialist or an idealist, nominalist, Platonist, monist, dualist, determinist or libertarian, intuitionist, formalist, etc. It seems easy to prove there cannot be one method which disproves every non-Christian worldview, because there cannot be one contradiction they all share. One could put this point even more simply as follows. The claim is that not every non-Christian worldview is internally incoherent. If by worldview we understand a set of propositions believed to be true by an agent, and by internally incoherent we mean that the set is inconsistent, then consider the non-Christian worldview that contains only one belief, P. This set is plainly not inconsistent. The retort will likely be that this ultra-simple worldview cannot, quote, account for the intelligibility of human experience. If so, what are the minimal conditions under which a set of beliefs could achieve this? It is not on the opponent of tag to provide this analysis. All they have to do is point out that without this analysis, proof cannot be claimed to be established. The proponent of tag needs to provide this analysis as part of the proof itself. Therefore, tag has not been established and is likely unprovable. Without an answer to this trilemma, tag falls apart. Instead, what we have is a rough and ready way of fending off other typically encountered worldviews, the sort of positions encountered while engaged in disputations with non-Christians. It is like a manual for new apologists to go off into the wider world armed with. But of course, the standards for what might prove useful enough for an apologist to do his job are different than the standards for a philosophical argument such as tag being proved successfully. A final closing trouble with the argument comes with traversing over from the conceptual necessity of God to the actual existence of God. As Butler writes, the problem, however, is that while tag demonstrates that the Christian worldview is a necessary precondition for experience, it does not prove that the Christian worldview is true. For it may be that our experience of rationality, morality, etc. are illusory. Bahnsen replied to Montgomery that we have made the, quote, gratuitous assumption that at least one worldview must be right is without foundation. Surely we can, for argument's sake, conceive the world being ultimately irrational and amoral. And if we can do this, it follows that tag, on this interpretation, fails to prove that Christianity is true. In conclusion, the best representatives of the presuppositional apologetic are trying to elicit a Copernican shift in the way that the worldview is argued for. The worst representatives are not trying to do this. What they're up to is trying to confuse the non-Christian by demanding philosophical justification for abstract concepts like logic, truth, morality, instead of addressing the actual arguments against Christianity. Any confusion on the part of the interlocutor is then pounced on as evidence that the argument has not been won by the Christian. There is a conceit behind such tactics, in that the argument is not being offered honestly. But behind all this is the view that autonomous thought, which is basically thinking for yourself, is the problem, and it is going to be hard to win an argument with someone who thinks that independent thinking is morally wrong. Believing that independent thought is a sin seems to me to be a hallmark of brainwashing, and at the very least, a rejection of the Enlightenment values that are typical of philosophical argumentation generally. It seems to me that they don't want to actually win the argument by being right, but instead they want to win an argument by exploiting a sense of philosophical vertigo and then using this vulnerability as an angle to hard sell religious dogma as the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Big Chum. So yeah, now we're going to go ahead and go to the responses part of our debate. And Perichoresis, you can go ahead and give your response.
Right. So the first thing I'm gonna address is that he mentions that transcendental arguments don't actually tell us anything about the world. It may tell us something about the way that we have to experience things, but then he goes on to say, but reality could just be illusory. Well, if you're going to operate in a world where reality is illusory, then your knowledge or your coming to know and perceive that the world is illusory would be part of the illusion, and therefore it's self-defeating. Now, what Chum seems to think is that I need to give an inductive analysis of every possible combination of worldviews, but the fact is there's only a few set paths that one can take once you start to question your foundational beliefs, right? And so, judging from the way that Chum was talking, right, he's saying, well, he can't just poke holes in my worldview because I can readily concede that I have no grounds to make assertions whatsoever. And this is to feign neutrality, right? It's to miss what I said earlier in my opening statement when I'm talking about how anytime we make assertions about the world, even an assertion like I am neutral, right, we're assuming things about metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. And so Chum wants to believe that the entire argument that he just gave comes from a set of foundational beliefs that he's unwilling to question, right? Which means he's unwilling to enter into a discussion about metalogic and about things like the problem of induction and the problem of universals. And he's unwilling to enter into that conversation. He just wants to be given those things in order to argue against God. And that's not how debate works. I don't grant you that your metalogical position or your meta epistemology, right, is rational, because you are ultimately basing all of your assertions in arbitrariness. And so when you come and try to assert that I need to do an inductive analysis of other positions in order for you to in order for the transcendental argument to be effective, it just misses the point, because the point is that you wouldn't be able to do an inductive analysis of a bunch of different worldviews without all of these preconditions. And those are the things that are in question. And it's fine if you don't want to ask those questions, but that's going to reduce your chain of justification for any epistemic warrant to arbitrariness. And so you would like for the audience to essentially believe that you can come to the debate tonight and win from a position of arbitrariness. And I don't think that that works. And that's really all I think I need to say. Because a lot of it was kind of like me. You were kind of just given a background so that the audience understood what was being talked about. And so your main point was either that transcendental arguments don't teach us anything about experience, but I would say that if you take a transcendental argument like the law of identity is false, and you take that statement to be asserted about the ontology of the world, right, then what you find is the law of identity must be ontologically the case, because the law of identity must exist in the world as the law of identity. And so transcendental arguments do teach us things about the ontology of the world, because assertions in and of themselves cannot be made sense of without assuming things about the ontology of the world. So I think that's pretty much where I'll leave it, and I'll concede the rest of my time.
All right, thank you, Perichoresis. But yeah, so Big Chum, feel free to go ahead and give your response.
All right, thank you. So, as I laid out in my opener, the tag argument has an almost certainly impossible task ahead of itself. Prove by argumentation that 1, the Christian view is able to account, make sense of intelligibility, argument, existence, even affirmation or denial propositions themselves, and 2, the set of all non-Christian views cannot. We have not seen this tonight. Undoubtedly, my poor, overburdened opponent has been unable to present an argument in his 10-minute opener and/or 10-minute rebuttal, and for good reason. This argument is so troubled and problematic that historically, even the theistic philosophical proponents of it have similarly been unable to make their case, which is why the argument has only a hollow outline with no filling, even for what have historically been its most ardent defenders and proponents. Van Til, Frame, Bonson, Matt Slick, Brigham Kate, Dyer, Oliphant. Let's look at some attempts made by Butler to see the difficulty of the case. So how do we establish that every other worldview is internally inconsistent? Fundamentally, that is the problem that must be resolved for tag and the presuppositional position generally to be viable. Butler first responds to the problem by giving an analogy he attributes to Greg Bahnsen. Suppose a basketball player, say Michael Jordan, beats every worthy opponent in one-on-one basketball games. He can justifiably claim to be the best individual basketball player in the world. Suppose further that another player confronts Jordan. His comeback is, just because you have beaten every current player does not mean that there isn't another who's better than you. Jordan's response can be anticipated. Bring on my next opponent. The theoretical possibility that there may be another player better than Jordan is not a concern to him. In the world of basketball, it is the one who is actually the best player, not the one who is possibly the best player, that is of importance. In the practice of apologetics, things are similar. What matters are actual worldviews, not possible worldviews. That's the end of the Bahnsen quote. Now, this comeback is demonstrably wide of the mark. In an important sense, it is possible worldviews and not just the actual worldviews that matters here, even for practice of apologetics. There is a logical gap between Jordan's unbroken record of success and the truth of his being the best basketball player, quote unquote. It is not logically impossible for him to win every game he plays and yet not be the best player. Likewise, in the case of worldviews, there is a logical gap between an apologist's record of debate success and the truth of the Christian worldview he defends. It is not logically impossible for someone to win every debate they ever engage in and yet argue for a false thesis. To bring out the absurdity in this kind of response, consider if it was actually held worldviews that mattered, rather than merely possible worldviews. Then one could prove that God existed by killing everyone who wasn't a Christian, thus leaving Christianity as the only actually held worldview. This, of course, would not prove it to be correct. Even though Butler says Bahnsen's analogy, quote, hits the mark, he also sees that it is woefully inadequate and states the problem clearly. Quote, if there are an infinite number of worldviews and tag only refutes a small slice of them, then it has not been established that Christianity is a necessary precondition of human intelligibility. That is, even granting that tag demonstrates the absurdity of all actual worldviews, it does not follow that all possible worldviews are likewise absurd. Butler acknowledges that Bahnsen's response is unsuccessful on the basis that winning the debate and that proving Christianity is a necessary precondition of human experience are two different things. Now, there is one final attempt made at bridging this gap of arguing tag, which directly focuses on the issue of something all non-Christian worldviews have in common, and in virtue of which they are necessarily inconsistent. What then is the nature of the non-Christian worldview? Simply put, all non-Christian systems presuppose that experience can be accounted for on autonomous lines. The non-Christian worldviews share the common feature that experience can be made sense of independently of God and his revelatory word. Here then seems to lie the root of the issue for the Van Tillian presuppositionalists. They argue that they can conflate every non-Christian worldview on the basis that they are all, quote, autonomous reasoning worldviews, as opposed to the Christian one in which independent reasoning is subordinated to the word of God. So the idea is that there is something wrong with the assumption that one can reason autonomously, which inevitably leads to self-contradiction. There are two objections here already. One, autonomy with respect to reasoning is not unique to the Christian worldview. For example, what prevents other monotheisms from claiming they also subordinate their reasoning to their God? And two, there are Christian worldviews where the intellect is not subordinated to the word of God. There are autonomous Christian worldviews. In fact, almost all conceptions of Christianity, apart from the Van Tillian presuppositionalist account, do not explicitly subordinate the intellect to the word of God. So the equivalence of the Christian worldview with non-autonomous reasoning fails in both directions. We have constantly sought to bring out that all forms of anti-theistic thinking can be reduced to one, end quote. Bahnsen elaborates on this important insight. Quote, the indirect manner of proving the Christian position is thus to exhibit the intelligibility of reason, science, morality, etc., within the context of biblical presuppositions, and then to make an internal criticism of the presuppositions of autonomous thought in whatever form it is being presently discussed, in order to show that it destroys the possibility of proving, understanding, or communicating anything. But what is it about autonomous reasoning that leads inevitably to internal inconsistency? Nothing in Bahnsen quote bring this assertion to light. This is what needs to be demonstrated. Otherwise, an equivalent counterclaim can be made that there is something inherently inconsistent about non-autonomous reasoning. If we do not have to say what it is about a certain type of reasoning that inevitably leads it to inconsistency, then each side can level its own unsupported assertion. There must be more than a simple assertion that autonomous reasoning leads to an internal contradiction. Otherwise, this is no better than just saying that God somehow guarantees it. I wonder even how one can have their, quote, reasoning be subordinated to the word of God. Don't you have to use your independent reasoning to make the decision to be subordinate to the word of God? How exactly does that thinking process work? It simply sounds like you're deciding to become an intellectual slave to your dogma. To impose such a requirement on others would be an external critique on other worldviews, though, not an internal one. Their apologetic can be reduced down to, you don't believe in my religion, therefore you're wrong. Each time the presuppositionalists argue there is no possibility of, or there is no ground for, this claim has not been supported. At most, there is the Michael Jordan type fallacy, where no actually held worldview has managed to account for these issues, but as we saw, this is insufficient to prove that no other worldview could. Thus, as its tag is unproven. To drive home this point further, I'll be providing some quotations of fellow Christians' critiques of presuppositionalism more generally. William Lane Craig writes, presuppositionalism is guilty of a logical howler. It commits the informal fallacy of begging the question, for it advocates presupposing the truth of Christian theism in order to prove Christian theism. Frame himself says that we are, quote, forced to say, God exists, presupposition, therefore God exists, conclusion, end quote. Even though such reasoning is clearly circular, it is difficult to imagine how anyone could, with a straight face, think to show theism to be true by reasoning, God exists, therefore God exists. A Christian theist himself will deny that question-begging arguments prove anything, end quote. Gary Habermas says, here Frame commits the informal logical fallacy of false analogy. He argues that rationalists must accept reason as an ultimate starting point, just as empiricists assume sense perception, and so on. So the Christian may begin with Scripture as a legitimate starting point. But these are not analogous bases. While the rationalist uses reason and the empiricist uses sense perception as tools from which to construct their system, Frames assume both the tool of special revelation and the system of Scripture from which he develops his theism. In other words, he assumes the reality of God's existence, his personal interaction with humans, plus a specific product, Scripture. Does Frame not realize that, in the name of everyone needing a presupposition, he has imported an entire worldview when the others have only asked for tools? But these presuppositions are not all created equal. Frame allows rationalists and empiricists their methodological quote hook, while he demands the hook, line, and sinker for Christianity. While the others still need to figure out how far their initial assumption will get them, Frame's kit came ready-made. He's all set to go fishing. Must the broad process of compiling evidence for the truth of Scripture now require us to judge the text by a more ultimate standard? What if this evidential method was actually taught in Scripture? Then it would seem that Frame's entire approach would have to be seriously amended. However, this is precisely what we find when we examine Scripture. Over and over again, with the help of several checks and balances, we are told to test God's revelation to us. Gary cites some examples: Deuteronomy 18:21-22, Isaiah 41:21-24, 44:7, Isaiah 41:25-29, 42:9, 44:24-28, 46:10, 48:5, 14, Isaiah 44:6 through 8, 52:6, 1 Kings 18:20-45, Luke 7:18-23, Acts 2:22-24. Habermas continues, these are just a few texts where both believers and unbelievers were told to examine history to ascertain God's truth. Audiences were regularly encouraged to use their minds and their eyes. They were witnesses, but there is no hint that these evidential challenges displease God by suggesting another ultimate standard being applied to his revelation. Indeed, God often made the challenge himself. And then if I have time, Kelly James Clark says, Frame makes many disparaging remarks about, quote, autonomous human reasoning as a standard of truth. I don't know of any philosophers who have suggested that reason is the standard of truth. A great many philosophers, however, have suggested that reason is the best human tool for figuring out the truth. And if reason is sufficiently broadly defined, it does seem to be the best human tool for discovering truth. Let us define reason in terms of all human beings' truth-aimed cognitive faculties: reasoning, induction, perceptual, oral, memory, and so on. We can include among the dominances of reason all of our properly basic and foundational beliefs, beliefs in the past, and so on. Is autonomous human reasoning a bad thing? If it's a bad thing, it is all the worse for us because it is all we have. Although people often oppose revelation to reason and suggest that revelation is superior, there can be, in the end, no real opposition. Here is the problem. Each person must decide, tacitly or explicitly, that a purported revelation is revelation. Each person must decide that what is being said in some particular holy writ is the voice of God. Each person must decide what is being said and then what it means. Frame says, to claim neutrality is to claim that I am the one who ultimately decides what is true or false. But surely I am the one who decides what is true or false. Who else could do that for me? Of course, our deciding does not make something true or false. That is not my point. My point is that each of us must make decisions using our best judgment about what is true and false. I don't see any other way around it. We have no other faculty than reason, in the broad sense, to come to our best judgment of which God to follow or not.
All right, thank you, Big Chum. Yeah, that will be your time. All right, thank you, Big Chum. I appreciate your response. So I was wondering if you guys wanted to go ahead and do pretty much like just question each other maybe in like a conversational style. Just going back and forth.
It might be good to let Perry respond to that.
Yeah, we can you can respond if you like.
Well, I mean, I'm down to just kind of, make it a little bit more informal at this point, because what I'm hearing from you, right, is essentially that you believe I need to do an inductive analysis of every worldview in order to prove to you that this is an effective argument. And so for me, I'm going to ask, well, what is the framework in which you're stepping back and doing this inductive analysis of worldviews? You're already presupposing all of the things that I'm calling into question, right? And
Okay,
so,
I can answer that if you like.
yeah, go
So
ahead.
it's not first of all, it's not an inductive analysis, it's an internal analysis. And I gave the quote from Van Til to show that when he was formulating his transcendental argument, that he argued that in order to show that all other views are internally inconsistent, that's the way that you do it. You assume that view, and then you use the points of that view to show that it doesn't stand up to its own standards. And that's the point there.
Right. And the reason that works at an individual level, like if I'm just having a real conversation with you, is because that very framework is the one that is providing the context in which you're making sense of sentences, or at least that's your claim, is that it's a viable context in order to provide you with meaning in your world. And I don't grant you that, just as you don't grant me that about the Christian God, right? And so,
but the
trying
tag
to
argument. Okay, go ahead. So you can finish.
No, go ahead.
I'm just saying the tag argument is first to show that Christianity can account for these things, and then show that other worldviews can't. And the way that you show that other worldviews can't, according to Van Til, who formulated this presuppositional approach, or this transcendental approach, is by taking on the other worldview and showing it to be false on its own merit. So that needs to be done in order for tag to have been made.
So it's not actually Van Til that formulated this, right? Van Til pulled this from other sources. There's actually a book called Irenaeus. It's called Irenaeus and an Orthodox Apologetic Methodology, a presuppositional apologetic, or a neo-patristic presuppositional apologetic. And so you can actually find this methodology within Scripture as well as within, the Church Fathers. And so it's not Van Til that actually formulated that. And it doesn't, you were correct that in order for this argument to be effective, we would need to flush out how Christian theology answers some of these questions, right? But my point to you is that the grounds upon which you're standing on, the chair upon which you are asserting all of these sentences and telling me that I need to justify things more and more, is got no meaning whatsoever.
But what the debate tonight is about the tag argument. So if we're discussing the tag argument, then we're actually staying on topic. And so if that needs to be still formulated and worked on, then it would seem that I've won the debate. But if your objection is that I don't have a worldview to argue from,
I don't think that I can teach you Eastern. I don't think I can teach you theology in 20 minutes, bro. And so what I'm trying to get across to you, right, in the context of this debate, is that the worldview from which you're speaking from doesn't leave you any place to make sense of anything. And so you come back at me telling me that you're making more assertions about the state of epistemology in the world, right? And those things.
The reason that you're saying that is because you find that the basis for it is arbitrary. But I wouldn't call it arbitrary at all. In fact, I would actually call it something that's necessary. So something like the existence of the self is transcendentally presupposed when you say that I can reason. So that's a transcendental argument. The external world existing is presupposed by transcendental argument when you say something like, I saw the sunrise this morning. A lot of things are presupposed by that. But the transcendental argument for God is trying to argue that God needs to be presupposed in order to make any statements and things like that, and that it's more fundamental than yourself, the existence of the self or the external world. And I'm not seeing that you've made that argument tonight. So if you have that argument, I'd cede as much time as you need to make that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the idea, right, is that, let's take, so you mentioned at some point something about empiricism and scientists. Are you an empiricist?
Yeah, that was in the opening. So I
Yeah.
think that empiricism is a great way of discovering facts about reality. But obviously, I'm not a strict empiricist. I think that empiricist and then rationalist, as Descartes formulated it, actually are fused and hybridized in the way that people see the world. So they use empiricism and rationalism, but they also presuppose certain contexts that they can use to make those things useful or applicable, rather.
Right. So if I was to ask you what route, am I correct in assuming that you take a classical foundationalist route when it
You know, I used to be a foundationalist. Well, actually, I would still call myself a foundationalist. But I think that other views like coherentism are actually pretty interesting as well. So I'm willing to consider those as well.
Okay, so you're kind of flip-flopping here though, right? Because what I'm trying to pin down is the frame. Like I'm trying to
I'm a
like
foundationalist.
why
That's the straight answer.
say what?
I'm a foundationalist. That's the straight answer.
Yeah, so you are a classical foundationalist, which is what I was picking up from the way that you were talking, which means that the context, right, that provides for the justification for any of your assertions is arbitrary. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, I disagree. It's not arbitrary. They're actually necessary foundations. They constrain the way that our intuitive faculties and our experience of the world operates.
Right, but
So in other words,
you
what's
can't
up?
consistently be a foundationalist and then appeal to a circular transcendental argument like you gave me earlier. Right, because if you're going to appeal to circular transcendental arguments like you kind of gave Moore's argument for the reality of the external world, where uh, there's a hand in front of my face, it would be impossible for there to be a hand in front of my face unless there's an external world, therefore there's an external world. You kind of gave an argument like that. Would you accept
Yeah.
the argument that the law of identity is false? It would be impossible for the law of identity to be false unless the law of identity is true. Therefore, the law of identity is true. Would you accept an argument like that?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fine. That's like that's a necessary kind
Right.
of
So
entailment.
that's to kind of flip-flop between a type of foundationalism and coherentism, right? Because foundationalists do not believe that you can be epistemically certain. Whereas someone that takes the route in the Munchausen's trilemma that I take does believe that circular arguments are viable when it comes to questioning presuppositions.
Well, no,
Right.
I think that
And
all
hold on.
circular arguments are
The,
okay. Go
the
ahead.
part that I think you're kind of missing, right, is that I'm saying there's a whole host of things that are required for you to make sense of your experience. And let's say that you want to take some type of materialistic view of the world, right? I kind of addressed this in my opening, but like if you do that, right, the point of tag to a materialist, right, is that that destroys any meaningful notion of any sentence. It completely crumbles the paradigm, and that person has no grounds left to even to assert anything with any epistemic force, right? And so it's saying that your view of reality is not just unable to account for these things. It's saying that your view of reality is actually incoherent and inconsistent with these preconditions. So it's not
Right.
just saying you can't account for them, but it's actually saying that whatever view of reality you're going to hold to, which as far as I can tell, it's like almost like a dualistic approach where there's some things founded in the physical world and there are some things that are true about the objects of thought.
Yeah. So um, I've not really heard an argument that I can't account for those kinds of things. It's just kind of been and from the method of tag, you would actually
Right. Well,
need to take on my view to show that. But so circular arguments are all false. They're all problematic. But what you did with the law of identity kind of thing is, if the law of identity is true, then questioning it means that it's false, which
Well,
means that it's true. So basically, just that in order
Well,
to question that it's true, if we assume that it's true, it shows that we can't arrive at that. So it's not a law of identity, therefore law of identity. It's kind of just law of identity, therefore transcendental argument, law of identity. Like even questioning it assumes that you need to apply it to the question. Same thing with like
right, and you're telling me you
intelligibility
accept those types of arguments, right?
Yeah.
But those would be ultimately circular, because you would
No, that
agree.
wouldn't.
Oh, yes,
No.
they would. Yes, they would, because you're assuming the law of identity in the act of proving it. That's
Because
certain.
because you've assumed it on premise one. Premise one, law of identity is true, and then you attempt to question whether you can be skeptical about it, and in being skeptical about it, you've needed to
Well,
assume it's
right,
true.
in order to
So
make
you already assumed that it's premise one. So if it's
in order,
true, then it's not circularly true, but any questioning of it would
well,
show that it's true.
you don't assume that it's true in premise one,
Person.
right? Because the goal of the transcendental argument is to get the skeptic who believes that the law of identity is false. That's the condition that the skeptic would be asserting, right? The law of identity is false. And so that's premise one. And then you say it would be impossible for premise one unless this other condition, which is namely the denial of premise one. Therefore, the denial of premise one is actually the case, right?
I mean,
but what I'm getting at, right, is if you're
sorry.
gonna accept arguments like that, then what you've kind of thrown yourself under the bus, right? Because what's
I don't
being
think.
given, well, it is, because you would accept that God is, in terms of discussing metaphysics, is the absolute, right? In the Christian worldview, God is metaphysically absolute. He's
Right.
that which has.
If we assume Christianity, you can kind of bring whatever to that Christian worldview, and then those things are true within that worldview. But
Right.
the thing with Tag is showing that all other worldviews are internally inconsistent and unable to account for things that God can. But I haven't heard that. But if anything, maybe we can get onto a related point. That it seems that you think that circular arguments are valid, and I was just wondering, which circular arguments do you find valid or good or invalid or bad? And what's your objection to if somebody were to use a circular argument to disprove the existence of God?
Well, first of all, if you're going to use a circular argument to disprove the existence of God, right, you're going to have to operate within some framework that doesn't have God within it, and so I'm going to be able to point out where that framework fails in being consistent with these preconditions for the intelligibility of our world, right? And I don't want to move off this just yet, though, right? Because you're telling me that you accept these arguments. Like, if I was to assert there is no truth, it would be impossible for there to be no truth unless there was a truth, and therefore that statement's false, right? There is truth. And you're telling me you accept all of these arguments, right? Which this is how I would justify that there is a set of interrelated preconditions that don't stand on their own, right? There's a whole host of these that I can give you these transcendental arguments for that don't stand on their own. They're all interconnected, they're all interrelated. And that points to something that connects and interrelates them all. And so that gives me the first premise, right? When somebody says there's a set of foundational beliefs that we start to reason from, which you've kind of said a few times, right? And that is, there is a set of interrelated preconditions that are required for the intelligibility of experience. And it would be impossible for that. And I'm telling you, right, that would be impossible unless the world is the way that the Christian worldview describes it to be.
Right, and that needs
you reject that, right?
Right, there needs to be an argument or demonstration of that. You're just saying transcendentals exist.
Right. Well, the argument is through a reductio, right? So the argument is through a reductio.
There is no reductio.
But there is a reductio, because I can show by your own admission that you I can show you by your own admission that you arbitrarily assert all of your assertions.
Well, it's not arbitrary, it's necessary. We've explained that, and I've explained to you in the opener and
Right,
rebuttal
and the
about
way and the way that you prove that
why
it's
reductio
the
hasn't been
way
done,
that the
why
way that
it's almost impossible to make a reductio.
the way that you prove that those things are necessary is to give me transcendental arguments. And so when I give you a transcendental argument for God that is the exact same, it is a metalogical argument in the exact same way, you don't want to accept it.
No, it's not. It's not a metalogical in the exact same way because
Yes, it is.
no. Well, you can say it's not, but let me respond to why it's not. Because um, it's different from other transcendental arguments in that it's saying that it's more fundamentally basic than other transcendental categories, and there's no actual demonstration of that. It just has to be assumed the same way that Christian worldview has to be assumed on presuppositionalism, and that's actually a much heavier
But
presupposition than what I'm.
that's not true, right? Because I'm telling you that I'm taking a circular route, right? And so I would tell you that
Then we need to talk about circularity. So you need to explain
what
what's the difference between a good circularity and a bad circularity, and what's your objection to somebody using a
right
good type of circularity to refute God.
well, good circularity is typically used to inform someone of something rather than to persuade, right? So you can use circularity to inform someone that in order to deny the law of identity is to assume it. And I can use circularity to show you that the context in which you're making sense of this debate is more of a context like the worldview I believe exists than the one that you believe exists. Because if I ask you, what is the absolute?
So,
What is the absolute that accounts for the viability of logic, and
so you've talked a
the
lot,
belief?
and
Yeah.
we've kind of gone away from the main question of the debate, which is tag a good proof for the Christian worldview? And so instead of talking about tag, you've just started talking about transcendental arguments generally, and you've asked me about my worldview generally.
No,
So
yeah, that's not all I did, right? I said that you use these other transcendental arguments that you're trying to give me to say these things are necessary in order to justify that there is a set of preconditions that are required for Big Chum Time to make sense of his experience.
well,
You're
I think
telling me
that
there's a
transcendental
set of
arguments are
you're
valid, some of
telling me
them, but I
you're
don't think
telling me
that
there's
they're
a
the only
set of
way to reach certain conclusions. So I think that there are other ways, like, for example, studying
right, but
axiomatically foundationally from a necessary starting point.
but when I question your presuppositions, you give me a transcendental argument. When you question my
Well,
presuppositions, I give you a transcendental argument that shows that Big Chum Time's view of the world
I gave
leaves
you a
them in a
transcendental
position.
argument to show that I'm not opposed to agreeing with transcendental arguments, full stop. But if you wanted me to justify them, I would
Right,
justify
and
them by appealing
I'm
to my
telling you
necessary
that's
axioms, my basic beliefs, my worldview, which inform and is the way that I learn about the world. So that's how I would justify any question that you would ask transcendentally.
how do you say that one more time? You
So
justify them.
based on the axioms and the basic beliefs of my worldview, which are necessarily formed, I would use those to learn about the world, epistemology, all that type of stuff. And that's the way that I would justify answering any question that you have in relation to how I know something.
Right. So do you
the basic
do you think
beliefs,
that do you think that something like reason is a self-evident maxim?
Well, it's definitely self-evidently useful, valuable,
Right,
proper,
but does
good.
that's not a meaningful term in a vacuum, right? You have to assume things about metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology to be able to talk about what reason is.
I mean, reason isn't just like a singular thing. It's a process of cognition, and
Right.
people
And
get
so
reasoning wrong
do you
all the
see
time.
how you
So
had do you see how you had to give me context in order to make sense of the term? Reason is cognition, right? And so that is to say that the ontology of reason is somehow tied to my brain.
okay, I don't see the.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So the ontology of thoughts are chemical. Well, you're going to have an issue of trying
Well,
to
brain and
explain
there's a distinction
how
between brain and mind,
how
possibly, but
well that
it's
would mean the
definitely tied to the
qualities
brain.
and relations of your thoughts are described in terms of physics and chemistry, which would leave you without intentionality.
They're influenced. They could be influenced by it, but they may not be determined by it because different people's thinking.
So there's
do you want me to start talking to you about theory of intentionality and self-knowledge and all that kind of stuff? We're like totally off base from talking about tag. We're
we're
just
not
saying
off
you have
base
to
from talking about tag, because
I don't understand how you
the
can know
point,
things,
right?
you
The
assume
point
things.
of tag is that there is an absolute that connects and makes sense of all of these preconditions. That's the point of tag. And I'm trying to explain to you that all of these preconditions that
That's
you
the
want
task
to,
ahead of you, yeah.
all of these preconditions, right, that you want to have don't make sense on the view of reality that you're putting forth. So you're telling me things like
One, you're
it
not
goes,
demonstrating that, and then
well, I
two,
did
that's
demonstrate
not
that,
even
right?
demonstrating
Because,
that tag is true either. So those are two things that you've yet to do.
well, I did demonstrate that, and I did tag is
I don't
true
think you
by the
have.
impossibility of your because you can't give me assertions.
Well,
You can't
first of
make
all,
it an
tag
assertion.
isn't true or false by the impossibility of my worldview. Once again, you actually need to disprove
Yeah,
all
and
other possible non-Christian
this
worldviews.
is
You need to define what the Christian worldview is,
this
and you need
this
to
is
show that
look,
the
this is
conceptual
where I
necessity leads to the
this is
actual
where
experience
I
of God.
mentioned to you that you think that I need to do an inductive analysis of every worldview.
Internal.
I called
Hold on,
it
it's internal.
inductive. I called it inductive because you think I need to go through a bunch of specific examples, and you're saying, well, there could be some examples that you haven't gone through yet. That's what you're saying. And I'm telling you that entire process is not possible without discussing metalogic. And so
If you
you're
think
going to have
it's
to,
not possible, then you're kind of conceding. So
what?
I said, first of all, it's
I
not
said
just
that the entire process is not possible without discussing metalogic. You're presupposing
I
in the
don't see how.
process of doing that induction is true, that logic is a viable means of determining truth. You're presupposing
Right,
all
but
of this in that process, and I'm telling you that God is more certain than all of these things. And you're saying, no, that's
you
not the
just
case. And so
created
I'm
my
asking you,
statement.
okay, Chum, you believe that there's
You
an interconnected set of preconditions that make sense of your experience. What is it that relates and connects all of
me, I'm
that?
the one experiencing them. But listen, if you're saying that we can't explain it without discussing metalogic, then
Well,
you're not
that's
actually giving. Then you're
solves.
actually raising another more difficult problem.
Do I need to go through? Do I need to go?
Me?
Sorry.
So the issue with tag is you need to show that no other worldview can. So if you're appealing to metalogic, now you need to go through the different worldviews with the different metalogics and show that those different metalogics can't exist unless God exists. So you've actually just made your job harder to show tag.
No, I haven't, because you're feigning neutrality, right? You think that all of those assertions you just made have ground and somehow give epistemic force to my need to go and justify further things, right? But the grounds from which you're doing that, as far as I can tell, accepts these transcendental arguments, which means you accept that there's a set of interrelated preconditions that are required for you to make sense of experience, which means, and you've said the thing that ties all those together is you, which is solipsism.
I'm the one that ties together all of my experiences. Yeah, I'm the one experiencing all of them. So
No,
the only thing that
that's not what I
tie them
asked,
together
though.
is you're the one that's
Right,
experiencing all of
because
it.
you're not you believe you're the thing that gives identity to objects over time. You're the context in which that makes sense.
Well,
That's
no, I
really
think
ridiculous.
I could think different things about what causes that to be, but you're asking me what ties together my experiences over time. Well, obviously the only thing would be me and my experiences. So
That's not what I'm
the
asking.
object that's experiencing.
Look, I gave you a list of things, right? The viability of logic, the
Yeah, I have it
belief
up here.
that the future.
Induction, meaning,
Yeah.
truth, epistemology, universal, sense data, man, unity, diversity.
Yeah.
But that's just running away from actually demonstrating tag.
No, it's not, because those things are involved in the first premise of tag. Those are the interrelated preconditions that Big Chum needs to be able to make sense of in order to make sense of his experience. Those
Not
that is the
exactly.
very first premise.
Not
Well, what
exactly.
are you telling me? Not exact. It's my argument.
Yeah,
Are you telling me that's not what I'm arguing?
Well, I can see an engine and not know how it works, and yet know that it does work. So, in order for me to make sense of things,
Works for what?
I need to make sense of further things.
Works for what? That's not a
for
complete sentence.
works as in
Work. Works for
Right.
what?
Propel an automobile, whatever the
Right.
deal
So
is. So,
so you can't do that without imposing a value system, right? And so it again just goes back to me pointing out that there's a need for the context in which
no,
Chum makes sentences. And the
so
context, as far as I can tell, is some type of dualism, and I can't really get much more out of that. And you're saying, well, I could concede to you that you're right. I just make arbitrary assertions, but
no,
you
I've
need to
never said
go.
that.
Well, you did say earlier in your opening that you could
I
concede
said that I
that if
could
I
concede
you
that,
said if
that
I
the
were to
worldview
poke
doesn't
holes
account
in
for
your
certain things.
worldview, right, that you could concede that you have no grounds from which to
For the sake of
speak.
argument, yeah. And then,
Yeah,
but for the sake of argument, you wouldn't have
yeah,
shown
and
tag, which is the
yeah,
point.
and I'm telling you
The
that
deal is that
I
you're
would
doing.
have demonstrated tag to you, right? Because that is the context in which you make sense of experience. And you see, do you think that I need to go through and analyze every
You don't
worldview?
need to
Hold on.
demonstrate
Do you think I need to go
You
through and
demonstrate.
analyze every worldview that rejects the law of identity?
Yes.
Why would
You
you
need to go
think
through
that
and
I need to do
analyze
that?
every worldview that rejects the Christian worldview or whichever Christian worldview you're proposing as
So you believe
giving
that
tag.
a worldview that says that things exist in the world not as themselves is a viable view of metaphysics.
It doesn't matter whether I think it's viable. The point of tag is to go through each worldview by their own scruples, by their own standards, and show that they can't make sense of
Right, and
whatever
I'm
whatever.
having the debate with Big Chum, right? And so the
But
worldview
the
that
debate is
Chum
about
is
tag.
putting,
It's not about my worldview. It's about tag, isn't it? So
yes,
it doesn't
and
matter.
tag deals with a set of preconditions that are required for experience, right? And do you believe that you can make an assertion and be neutral in the realm of metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology?
Well, maybe not, but it's not. It's not
Right. So now,
relativistic.
okay, you're right. You can't be neutral. So why are you pretending as though the position from which you're telling me that I need to do this stuff with these other worldviews, right? That's not a neutral
Still do
position.
an internal
That would
bias.
only make sense, right? In a worldview where things are not grounded in the ontology of the human mind. You can't ground universal
Have to
principles in
be
flux
neutral to do
matter.
an internal critique.
Huh?
I think you're confused on whether or not you need to be neutral to do an internal critique. You don't have to be neutral.
You can only launch an internal critique from a view of metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. That's my point.
Okay, then you disagree with tag.
No, I don't. You don't understand tag, because the whole
Then you should have
purpose of
actually.
the whole.
Then you should have actually.
Do you think that tag is an argument that concludes in the existence of God?
Yes.
You're incorrect.
The
Tag is an
tag. I can go back to my
tag
dictionary
is an
here. The tag
illustration,
argument
but
shows
the
the
viability
Christian
of
worldview.
logic, the context in which you make sense of a term
Right.
like arguments, that's what's in question.
The tag argument, the conclusion of which shows that in order to make sense of experience or affirm or deny any proposition, you must first presuppose God and the Christian worldview.
It's not a
That's what the
deductive
transcendental
argument,
argument for
is
the
my
existence of
point,
God.
is because deductive logic is in question, right? So is induction.
Yeah, it can't be deductive or inductive. It's a transcendental argument, even though some people say that it is a kind of deductive argument.
It
Basically,
can be
say of the set of all
illustrated
non-God
deductively,
worldviews,
right? It
all
can
of
be
them stand
illustrated
account
deductively.
are inconsistent. Therefore, the God worldview is left. But that itself either, which I've mentioned out as well, doesn't get you to the Christian God, and it actually doesn't get you to the necessity of the presupposition of the Christian worldview, because for the sake of argument, like I said in my rebuttal or my opener, I think it was, you can imagine that the world is kind of just a randomness, and that there is no possible worldview which can account for certain things like that. And in which case, if you assume that one of the worldviews of the possible set of worldviews can get you to truth, then that's a false assumption.
Right. So that takes me right back to where you're essentially saying reality may be an illusion, or illusory, or the way that we experience reality may be illusory. And so the very statement that you just made could be part of that illusion, and your coming to know and understand that would be
That's
part of the
Butler's
illusion.
argument.
And so that would be self-refuting.
Well, that's Butler's argument.
Right, that would be self-refuting.
Well, if you were to assume within different possibilities, that could be a possibility. And if that is the truth, then we're not actually, if that is the case,
No, it
then
can't
it
be
is
a
not possible
possibility.
for that kind of thing.
It's not a possibility because it's inconsistent and incoherent and self-refuting.
Well, it's not with respect to your starting point.
Right, and you're
which is-
talking about possible worlds or possible worldviews, and the reality of possible worlds and what isn't possible and then what is impossible is going to be determined by some larger context. And what I'm trying to get you to see is that the context in which you're trying to make all of these arguments doesn't hold any water. Because let's say you ground reality and material, like I said earlier, well, then distinction or unity is going to become illusory, as well as change or identity.
You're going for option B right there again, which was the closest thing you did to demonstrating tag. But in order to demonstrate that option B is possible, then you would actually need to check what it is that a worldview needs to have in order to make certain things intelligible, or what a worldview needs to have in order to be able to affirm or deny propositions. And then in which case, all the worldviews that share those things are the worldviews which are possible worldviews. And if there are any non-Christian worldviews in that list, then that means that tag is defeated.
But there are no non. If the Christian world, do you think the Christian worldview is possible?
Metaphysically, sure.
Metaphysically, sure. Right, which would mean
Right.
if the Christian worldview is possible and it is the case, then what you
I mean, it
just said
depends
is
on your conception, really.
if the Christian worldview is the case, then what you just said would be false, right? Because the Christian worldview would entail that logic and all of these other things are
Okay,
dependent
well,
upon God, right? So
then you just undercut yourself.
in no way did I just undercut myself.
You said if it's possible, then it's not true that it's possible. It's necessary.
That's not
So
what I said.
I wouldn't
right?
agree.
I said
Yeah,
if the Christian worldview is the case, then your claim that there are other possible worldviews within the set of possible worldviews is false. That's what I said.
But that's just saying if you assume, if it's possible that naturalism is true,
Right,
then
but you just
then the Christian view is impossible. Or if it's possible that non-theistic dualism is true, then Christianity isn't possible. So you're just saying, you're just assuming again.
Well, I'm not just assuming, I'm pointing out that views of metaphysics are mutually incompatible, right? And so the view of metaphysics that you're speaking from is mutually incompatible with all these other worldviews that you want me to talk about. And if I'm trying to get across a point to you, it doesn't make any sense for me to explain to you that Hindus have a monistic view of God and therefore distinction is an illusion in their world, which is
But then
absurd.
you're just talking about how you're unable to meet your burden of proof to show that tag is true. In which case, I've won.
I don't accept the claim that that is my burden of proof, right? Because you're trying to say that there's a ground from which you can reason outside of the worldview which you're bringing to the debate. And that's not the
what
case.
I'm saying. The topic of the debate is the transcendental argument a good proof for the Christian worldview? It's not, can Big Chum offer a worldview? Which
And why in my opening statement did I claim that it was an effective way to argue? Do you remember?
It's an effective proof. And first of all, the transcendental argument is only made when all other worldviews are refuted, right? So focusing on one specific worldview gets you no further.
Incorrect. That's incorrect.
Okay.
Right?
So I like right now I would like to thank you both for dialoguing civilly with each other. It's definitely an interesting conversation. Are there any like final responses that either of you would like to say before we move on to audience question and answer?
Yeah, I would just say that I appreciate Chum coming to the debate, and I think it was a good discussion, and I hear what he's saying, right? I just don't agree with it. I don't agree with this idea that he thinks in order to prove to him that it's an effective proof, that I need to disprove a bunch of other worldviews. As I said in my opening, right? It's an effective proof because it forces the skeptic to enter into a paradigm level comparison of worldviews. And the Christian worldview will come out on top. When you're talking about worldviews, you're talking about the very nature of reality and the things that provide for the context of the meaning of our sentences. And so you don't actually have to do an inductive analysis of every worldview to show one person that it's an effective proof. He's right that if I was talking to a Hindu, I would need to change up my argument a little. But he's not a Hindu. He doesn't speak and make sense of reality in the same way that a Hindu does. So it would be a waste of time for me to talk about Hinduism if I'm having a conversation with him. So that would be my closing.
All right. Thank you, Perry. And Big, would you like to make a closing statement?
Sure. So I think what I've done in this debate is I've shown that the transcendental argument was not made, that transcendental arguments are nearly impossible to make, and my opponent Shirley tonight has not actually made a transcendental argument. At best, he's just kind of said, you can't do it, which is fallacy. Name escapes me right now. But he acknowledged, even in his opener here, he said, at the base, these views are not justified. And that acknowledges and undercuts his own argument that he made. So I'd say that a lot more work needs to be provided than what currently exists, including describing what about autonomous reasoning makes it so that you can't account for X or other, affirmations and denials, and why other theistic views aren't capable of non-autonomous reasoning, and refutations of all possible worldviews rather than held worldviews. Otherwise, we're just making another Michael Jordan fallacy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Big Chum, and thank you, Perry. I appreciate the debate. It was definitely very interesting. Yeah, so I guess at this point we'll just open up the floor to the audience, and they can ask questions to Big Chum or Perry, about their worldviews and anything that was, discussed during this debate. And so
just keep it in text chat. And if you want to ask in voice, we can unmute you, but.
So are we getting mods to read out the questions directly?
Yeah, I'm gonna get them right now. Tasteless Opinion asked for Chum, what does it mean for something to be justified?
Justification just means that, so ontologically, justification means that something's existence is dependent on something else. Epistemologically means the same thing, but that the something else may or may not actually exist in reality. So the basis, like your basic beliefs that form the basis of your worldview, those kind of things exist in not strictly reality in the physical sense.
All right. We'll get the next one. Oh yeah, this is one that I thought of. Big Chum, why is all circular reasoning fallacious? Or why is circular reasoning always fallacious in your view? Or circular argument?
Circular reasoning is an informal fallacy. Basically, you're assuming the truth of the proposition. Well, sorry, the conclusion appears within the premises of the argument. Now, if it's true that A, then obviously you can get A equals A. But if what's in contention is A, then circular reasoning doesn't actually help to establish that A.
All right. Tasteless Opinion again. Tasteless, this is the last question we'll let you ask because you already asked one. For Chum again, is it possible to have a belief without a reason for it? I don't really see the purpose of that question, but
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, the reason would just be, in the worst case, like something that you've misapprehended, or like something that you've just made up about reality. But usually beliefs are formed on the basis of inferences from experiences of reality.
Seiko, for Chum again, do you find all forms of transcendental reasoning to be invalid?
No. Like I said in the Q&A section, there are some transcendental arguments that we would agree are valid and follow, but arguments of the transcendental sort of God specifically make transcendental arguments about certain kinds of things, and then it's almost as if they make some kind of meta transcendental argument that ties God to those things, but that connection isn't as readily apparent or as easy to grasp as transcendental arguments. And so if that's the case, then there actually needs a lot more work to be done to show that connection. But I actually don't think that connection is possible for the reasons that I gave in the debate.
Right. So I would just say that I think they just made you contradict yourself, because you said that all circular reasoning is logically fallacious, and then you accept some circular transcendental argument. So that would be an inconsistency. But
I distinguish between circular and transcendental.
right. Well, you may want to. It would be a distinction without a difference, right? Because you would agree that if I was to try to give you a transcendental argument for the law of identity, that I'm assuming the law of identity, and so I'm assuming the very thing in question in the attempt to prove it, and so it would be circular. And so there are apparently some circular arguments that you do accept.
I think that there's a different form, but
Okay. We don't have to get back into the debate, but Tonlock for Chum again. How do you look at an object such as a rock, a basketball, a stapler, etc., and assess whether it's evidence or not evidence for the grounds of any said worldview?
well, I guess worldviews explain pieces of data differently, but the question isn't whether the individual pieces of evidence are good ways of validating the worldview, but tying all the evidences together and which model incorporates less excess baggage to explain, while also explaining more of the data would be what you would do in.
All right, tasteless. We're not gonna do that question because I told you that you only get. Okay, one for Perry from Seiko. Are you a divine conceptualist about universe?
So I suppose it would probably be some type of divine conceptualism. So I would hold to something called the doctrine of the logos and the logi. And so that believes that all universals are ultimately grounded in the mind of God. And humans have access to universals through a combination of sense experience and through the use of a faculty known as the nous. Right. And so that's kind of like the eye of the soul or the intellect. And it's what lets us draw distinctions amongst the world and operate in our reality and know the patterns and archetypes behind creation.
Can I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, on divine conceptualism, if propositions such as the laws of logic are thoughts of God, then propositions are effects of God, with God as the cause. And God exists would be one such proposition, which means that causally prior to God thinking, it's neither true nor false that he exists. So it needs already, and that's absurd. So it actually has to be true that he exists in order for him to think.
Right. So the Christian conception of God would say that God transcends these things because he's the very ground of these things. And so things like logic are considered eternal or uncreated actions, and they're kind of analogous to human thoughts, right? It's not a univocal example, but they are analogous to human thoughts, and that they are energetic or operations of God, but we believe that they're uncreated and eternal operations. And so I don't think that the criticism stands. But
Okay.
If it's transcendent and analogous, that kind of leads to more questions, which is, whether or not saying they're transcendent is a way of getting away from the objection. And analogous, things that are analogous need to actually have a common property. And with God and human conceptions of things, it seems that in all instances, when you drill down far enough, there actually is no analogous property.
Any response, Perry?
I didn't listen well enough to give him a response, to be honest with you. I had a dog doing something. I apologize.
All right. Then we'll take Brenda's. I have a question for okay. How does this is for you, Perry. How does assuming something to be true make it?
Right. So this is to misunderstand the argument. The argument is not that you just assume God to be true. That would be a view of classical foundationalism, right? And so that would be to take the axiomatic route. And what I'm saying is that the explanation of all of these things will appeal to ultimately the revelation God has given to his church, and that will assume that God exists and that God is the source of truth and all of these things. That will be ultimately circular, and that is because God is the ultimate grounds from which all dependent or contingent facts draw their viability and meaning.
Okay. Are you I know it's kind of Perry. Are you a Orthodox guy?
Dude, I'm up in I need to get in a parish. I can tell you that.
Okay. I was just wondering. Let's see what else. I don't think there's many more. Oh, okay. Another one for Perry from Seiko again. So, given that universals are a part of God's mind and are known through the senses and nous, would that make oneness and manyness known through these two media?
That make
I could repeat it if you want.
it seems that oneness is in some sense universal, right? Because they're all of anything that I talk about is one thing. And so there are many instances of this kind of metaphysical unity across the world. And so I would say that our understanding of oneness and manyness comes from that's a hard question, man. I'm not sure if they're energetic or not. I'd have to research my theology a little bit.
Yeah, that's more of a theological question.
It's a theological question, and I would have to research a little bit to give you a proper answer.
All right. We'll take it like one or two more, unless you guys don't mind keeping it. But it seems like we're not getting a lot. So
Yeah,
okay.
and I've been up pretty long, and I got to go work. So
yeah, we'll ask two more, and this is one right here. Maybe this is for Perry again. It's a reformulation. What are truth makers in your worldview? So I guess it's like what makes things true in your world.
Right. So what's going to make things true is that they cohere with the specified set of propositions that are in the mind of God, so the omniscient mind of God. And so things that are true conform to the mind of God.
This one's for Chum, from Tanlock again. How do you account for universals?
I would just say that things which share common properties or family of similar enough interrelated properties are what we would call universals. Also, mathematical constants and that type of thing exist possibly as brute contingent facts of the universe, or just brute facts of the universe.
So would you say the laws of logic are universal?
I don't think so. I think they constrain our intuitive faculties, and that if we were to see something which violated the laws of logic, we wouldn't be able to process it except erroneously as with the laws of logic.
All right. Well, I think that settles it. I think this is a pretty good discussion. We got a little bit off topic at some parts, but I actually thought it was pretty well done. This is usually what happens. So, thanks, Big Chum, and obviously Perry. I know Perry has a hard work schedule, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, guys.
All right. If you guys want to leave or do whatever now, the debate's officially over. If you have any questions, for them. Q&A's over, so sorry.
Yeah, we can also just unmute everyone and let them.
Yeah, we can unmute everyone.
Yeah, I'd have to change the channel thing. Honestly, if you guys want to talk about it, I would just go. If you guys want to talk, I would just go down
Don't
to
leave, please, so I can.
Thank you guys for hosting the debate, and
problem, big
thank you for the discussion, Perichoresis.
Yeah, Chum, it was nice to meet you, man. It was a great discussion. And
Hey man, I actually this wasn't our first meeting. If you look in your DMs, I messaged you about a year and 4 months ago with Malpass's article actually refuting and showing the problems with tag, and I used a lot of those ideas in the debate. So actually surprised that you weren't a little bit more ready for some of my objections.
well, see, I don't really think that you're direct. I'm not trying to be rude, but from my perspective, your objections don't really hold water because you're not giving me any grounds from which you're making these objections. And that's why it's kind of hard for me to even, I don't know what you believe and I don't want to misrepresent you. So that's why I kind of tried to tackle some type of materialistic view of the world because that's typically what atheists believe. But so,
All right, guys. If you guys want to
but it was
talk
a
about
great
it,
discussion, yeah.
if you guys want to talk about it, just go down to